This will be provided by Rob Whiteman, who's Chief Executive of CIPFA. He was appointed to that post in 2013. By profession, he's an accountant, but had previously held Chief Executive posts at the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, the DEAR, and the UK Border Agency. Rob is a well-known commentator and writer on public service reform and modernisation across the public sector. I think it's fair to say that he should be credited with raising CIPFA's profile in the past few years since his appointment. And some of the presentations and some of the announcements he's made have certainly ruffled a few feathers, I think. So if I hand you over to Rob Whiteman.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Yeah, you're all towards the back. It's quite empty at the front. It reminds me of Saturday morning cinema when I was a child. I hope the motivation for the back row is different to when I was a when I was a teenager. But I'm keeping my eye on you. Can I give an apology for my croaky throat? I'm absolutely fighting fit, but those of you who know me well will know I had surgery a few weeks ago to remove my gallbladder. My advice is never get a gallstone. But although I'm really, really better, it has left me with a croaky throat, and I won't go into the horrible detail of how I had a tube all down me during the operation, but exactly. But I did. So if I suddenly walk out for a coughing fit, forgive me. I will say, start off with a few words about the economy and talk about the position of the UK government and talk about the spending review yesterday. I'd then like to say a few words about what I think happens next and finish with some challenges for the finance profession or opportunities for the finance profession in all of this. To start at the top, next year the global economy will probably grow a little compared to this year. Most economists think we'll see a bit of global growth, but strangely enough that's counter-cyclical in that this year growth was not as high as expected because global growth has been really driven by the emerging markets, and this year the emerging markets had rather a difficult year. It's actually a overhang to the debt crisis that we suffered in 2008 has been hitting the financial services and the instruments markets in the emerging markets. So next year's growth will be higher than this year's growth for the global economy, but strangely enough, in terms of cycle, we are now nearer to the next recession than we are to the last one. Now, I'm not saying there's a recession around the corner, it's years away, but in terms of the global economic cycle and what will happen to Europe and what will happen to the United Kingdom, we are nearer the next recession than the last one. We're not on sort of confident growth anymore, in spite of this, what will happen between this year and next year. And this this growth period has probably been quite disappointing in many ways for a lot of parts of the UK. Growth hasn't been uniform and it's been patchy, and it's not been as good a recovery as we have previously enjoyed. And to some extent, when we hit the next recession, 3-4 years down the track, George Osborne is hoping 5 years down the track. Whoever laughed there, you're mine now. Whenever I say something funny, I sort of look to you. So, thank you, sir. We are nearer that next recession, and actually it will be a difficult time when we get to it because this hasn't been as good a recovery as we would expect. For the UK, there are a couple of issues that we have to grapple with. The UK has relatively low productivity. Why is that? So whilst we have as good a growth as anybody in the G7, our growth is top of the G7 along with the USA and better than the Eurozone. Why is it that productivity hasn't really moved forward in the UK economy? And to some extent that means that our growth is simply fueled by extra spending rather than better and new ways of production to increase the productivity of the economy, which actually means we will fare better in terms of our international trading position. And there you go. The productivity bells are ringing. And that's one issue to deal with. The other issue, of course, to deal with is the national debt. Usually, national debt has been about 40% of the size of our economy, of GDP. The Chancellor had to make some changes yesterday to national debt figures because housing associations have been scored as being in the public sector and on the public sector balance sheet by ONS, much to his chagrin, I imagine. But you know, we're in the 80s. We're at 80% of GDP in terms of our national debt. Now, you'll know that yesterday, and I'll say a bit more about this, the Chancellor plans that by the end of this Parliament we will be in surplus and starting to pay back some of that national debt. But just to put it in perspective, he is hoping that by the end of the Parliament we will be running an annual surplus of 0.5, 0.6% of GDP. If he could achieve a 1% surplus, it would take 18 years of continuous 1% surplus in order to get our debt back to where it was before 2008. So he won't have, the UK won't have 18 years of paying back debt because there'll be another couple of recessions in that period when we have to borrow. But just to put in perspective the size of our debt, it is large. It's large by international standards. Some countries, of course, are famously much higher than us. Maybe I should say allegedly rather than famously. You may have heard me say before that if Greece adopted IFRS or IPSAS and accounted for its public sector in the same way that we do, its debt would probably be about 50% of GDP and smaller than us, and certainly smaller than Germany and the other nations that have been demanding stark and harsh treatment. It's because the Maastricht Convention calculates debt really at its face value at the time of it being issued rather than allowing for any time value or repayment. And so actually Greece is less indebted than us. And where the UK, I'm afraid, is unique is that we also have a lot of personal debt. Of course, interest rates have been very low. We've all taken those fantastic deals to get new cars for nothing. Sadly, many of them diesel, in my case. The good laugh, it's just marvellous, thank you. When you add together public sector debt and personal debt, we're about as highly leveraged as any economy. We're up there with Japan in terms of being the most leveraged economy in terms of debt. Strangely, corporate Britain isn't really in debt. It's obviously a bit frightened that the banks might not give finance as easily. And so corporate Britain is sitting on over 500 billion of cash reserves. I do like to point this out when the Chancellor criticises local authority reserve policy, that actually corporate Britain is sitting on an absolute mountain. The other issue that Britain uniquely will have to deal with in its public finances is our healthcare system. Whether we live in Wales, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, we very often vote on what we think of the NHS. It's a pivotal issue for the UK because uniquely we have a service which is free at the point of use, paid for out of taxation. And we're all very proud of that. And really the evidence is that it's an efficient way of running a healthcare system. Our healthcare is 8% of GDP. During the Blair-Brown years, it rose from 5% to 8%. If NHS budgets were not protected, as is happening in England, it would have fallen back to 6%. And so by protecting NHS budgets for the UK overall, healthcare will stay at about 8% of GDP. Does anyone know what it is in the USA? What percentage of GDP Americans spend on health? 13, 14. 18%, even higher, 18%. So in economic terms, we have a very efficient healthcare system because it's a big nationalised industry free at the point of use. But it does create a particular problem, which is healthcare spending is inexorably rising in every developed country. When the NHS was created over 60 years ago, it was basically doctors and nurses, wasn't it? It was 2% of GDP. Defence was 10% of GDP after the war. And since the war, defence has gone from 10% to 2% because we haven't had many wars. Don't know quite how I can say that. We haven't had, and the NHS has gone the other way. But it was doctors and nurses. It wasn't MRI scanners, complex chemotherapy. And in every economy of the world, healthcare spending is rising as a proportion of GDP. For us, of course, governments for the last decade have not wanted to tax beyond 38% of GDP, and indeed, will probably now will move to about 36% of GDP. That means, in effect, that given some other factors, the rest of the public sector gets crowded out by the growth that we have to give in the NHS. And you know, I'm certainly in no doubt that for the Chancellor yesterday, although he put money into the NHS, it will last a year or so, and the spending crisis and many trusts being in deficit will be back certainly, you know, by midway through this Parliament, and he has therefore some thorny issues to deal with. Of course, the public would demand nothing less. We all expect to have our gallbladders or whatever else dealt with as efficiently as possible. From my perspective, you know, we're not politicians, we're professionals. I think there are some areas of prioritisation which are less justifiable. The triple lock on pensions basically accounts for about a third of AMI. Sorry, I'll come to that in a moment. Is it really justifiable to put pensions up by higher than the underlying rate of inflation? When universal pensions were introduced 100 years ago, there was pretty much universal poverty for old age. The average age was about 66 and a half. So on average, men lived about 18 months past their retirement age, and there was universal poverty. By the end of this Parliament, colleagues, median pensioner income will be higher than median income. And so actually the working age population overall will be paying their taxes to pay pensions to a group of people who are better off than they are. And actually, it's been a good few years for many pensioners. There are pensioners living in, you know, very dire circumstances. But the point that I'm making is there's not really any economic justification for keeping the triple lock on pensions and not means testing that. But 70% of pensioners vote. That is an intoxicating reason for politicians of any political hue in any part of the United Kingdom. I think the government is going to have the NHS to deal with. It's going to have a difficult time on welfare reform, although the tax credits were taken out as a saving now. That will come back when universal credit bites in. And I also think that the government will have a difficult time on the EU referendum. I think it will move closer in the polls. And when you look at the Scottish referendum, it didn't settle the issue, did it? In fact, it made it bigger. And indeed, the referendum on AV, nobody even remembers it happens, and now talk about should we have proportional representation. I suspect that the debate on Europe will go on long after the referendum, particularly if it's close. And that will create a really very difficult position for the governing party. So at the moment, it does pretty much look like George Osborne will be there for 10 years, 4 years as Chancellor and 6 years as Prime Minister. In the UK-wide election, your choice in 2020 is Osborne, Corbyn or Fallon. I think you could have a pretty good bet on George Osborne if he succeeds, being there for 10 years. And I think they feel pretty confident at where they are. But the EU referendum, welfare reform, an NHS crisis, a week is a long time in politics. Or Macmillan, of course, more famously said, when asked Prime Minister what most frightens you, thinking he would say nuclear holocaust or world poverty. Of course, he said, events, dear boy, events. And the government is going to have to put more money into counter-terrorism and defence, as it did yesterday. So we are saying that we will maintain defence now at 2% of GDP, as at the same time we guarantee 0.7% in international development. So my take on yesterday's comprehensive spending review was that the Chancellor got lucky. OBR adjusting the modelling for VAT income and some other things gave him around 6 or 7 billion a year, over 20 billion over the lifetime of the Parliament. He therefore decided not to take cuts in tax credits, policing, further education also didn't take any further savings. At the same time, he introduced some new taxes, which I think was fiscally sensible, the stamp duty on second home and buy-to-lets, the levy on apprentices, and also giving local authorities in England the power to put a precept for social care. But interestingly, borrowing will now be higher in the middle of the Parliament than it was due to be before the spending review. But his bacon has been saved, if you'll forgive the metaphor, by our OBR forecasts on growth, which, because they upgraded their forecasts on growth, he will be borrowing more in the middle of the Parliament. He's let a lot of areas off their savings, but growth means that it's now modelled that he'll be into surplus before the next general election, roughly at the previous position it was. So my view is that the Chancellor's very lucky. If things moved against him, if the world economy got worse, then actually the deficit, it wasn't a good day for the deficit yesterday, because we will end up with a higher deficit position than we otherwise predicted because of his giveaways. I don't know whether devolution will be a big political issue for this Parliament in all parts of the United Kingdom. Clearly there were the announcements yesterday of tax-raising powers without a referendum here. He is pushing the button on things like Devo Manc and devolving health to Manchester, to Greater Manchester. If you'd said to me 3 or 4 years ago a Chancellor of the Exchequer would devolve the NHS to a region within England, I would have thought that was inconceivable. But there is something going on in English politics which I don't quite understand, that somehow the English want something that the Scots, Welsh and Northern Ireland have got in terms of devolution. And so suddenly there's an interest in devolution which perhaps there hasn't been before. I don't think that's a trap for him, other than maybe Scotland. I mean, clearly if there was a Brexit, Scotland would leave the United Kingdom. But other than that, I don't see a bear trap for him. I see the bear traps as those that I've just said: welfare reform, the NHS, and the EU referendum. If that's the position where we are, what happens next? I'm usually a pretty cheerful guy. I'm going to get really miserable now. Please don't think that this is just a few years of difficult austerity and then it will be all right again, because it won't be. The ageing population means that we do have a greater burden coming of cost for people of retirement age, a smaller working age population compared to the size of our population. Interestingly, there are many parts of the UK which are in a much better position than our competitors. We have a younger working age population than Germany, where the proportion between the working age population and the retired population is due to be even more sort of against the working age population. What's different in the UK is immigration. I live in a city in London where 70% of children are born to mothers born outside of the UK. The average age of a Londoner is a good 10 years younger than the average age of other major cities in the UK, and certainly a lot younger than the other capital cities of Europe. And although I don't think immigration will be seen as a good thing entirely in the EU referendum debate, in economic terms it provides the UK with a younger, more skilled workforce, which helps in terms of the age demographics that are coming against us. But the ageing population is a significant issue. There will, at some point be a better recovery for the world economy. I think interest rates are going to stay where they are for a while yet. The Fed is signalling that it's going to put up interest rates. The European Central Bank is saying not in a million years. If anything, it will cut the negative rate that's already there. The UK may be somewhere in the middle. But we must hope in a way, fiscally, that interest rates stay low, as I believe they will, although it would be better for the economy and help if the finance system was working as normal for interest rates to rise. Every 1% rise in interest rates costs the Treasury £8 billion in extra debt repayments. If interest rates were to go up by more bells, productivity and debt today. If interest rates did creep up, say by 2% over the lifetime of a parliament, it would cost the Treasury 16 billion quid. That's quite a lot of shekels, really. So the prognosis for the rest of the century will be significant public sector pressures. And my advice to you is don't think this is a temporary measure. And I think what that means for us is we have to take the savings that are credible and best to take rather than the ones that are easily agreeable. And in a way, if I think of my career as a director of finance, I quite liked easily agreeable savings because they did my job for me. But I think we have to be more careful now and not just take things because we can cut them, but because it's the right thing to do, because austerity is here for a long time. I talk to a lot of people up and down the country, and people worry about some of the services which have been decimated. I was in Hertfordshire this morning talking at their leadership event. It's a big county. And people were saying, can we really go 10, 15, 20 years without a youth service? Can we really cut our regulatory services to the bone? In England, where councils have lost 40% of their funding over the lifetime of the last parliament, actually councils put more money into children's services. CIPFA stats show that children's services went up by 5%. So actually regulatory services such as planning, such as licensing have been cut by 50% or more. Is that sustainable over a long period? So I think as accountants we have to think about advising our political masters on taking the savings that are needed, that are best, and not just the ones which are easily agreeable. And that's a real challenge for us, I think. And it also means we have to have better tools of assessing early intervention, upstream activity. All of us in the room, if we're asked a capital investment decision, we sort of go net present value and everybody understands it. But if you think about some of the work that Andy did in aligning public services, the ALPS work, if we're asked a business case for investing in some early intervention, where the beneficiaries may be different to the budget holders that put the savings in, and some of the longer term measures of the effect of that early intervention are more economic or outcome indicators than fiscal ones, as they often are, do we have a tried and tested method of deciding that investment decision? In the NHS there have been some things near it, like QALYs, if we invest in this treatment it's X number of better years, quality years. But we don't really have anything like that for investment appraisal, and I think we're going to have to invent something like that, so that if you're being asked, is it a good idea to invest in public health, is it a good idea to be investing in upstream activity with young people, you don't have to reinvent how it will happen. On the whole, for us as finance professionals, I think the next 5, 10, 15 years mean that we'll pay more attention to the balance sheet. It's interesting comparing public and private sector. Since the war, most of the really large corporates have moved from their value being on the balance sheet in fixed assets to being the value that they add through their production. Their balance sheets have got much smaller in terms of fixed assets, whilst for the public sector we have retained very, very large balance sheets in terms of the assets that we are utilising. So although at times we might have quite sort of sophisticated debates about what's the best way of valuing Cardiff City Hall, you know, is it a replacement value, or should we really move to a valuation that allows for the fact that if you could get planning permission on residential value, not saying you can, then actually that's the alternative, and we should be forced to think about the real value, the true value of ours. Actually, I think that's the right thing to do, because I suspect that all public bodies are sitting on large balance sheets relative to their revenue position, and I think as accountants we will want to look at that much more. In its own little way, CIPFA did this, didn't it? You know, I absolutely loved Robert Street. I used to hug it when I walked in. I thought it was beautiful. I absolutely loved every sort of crack in the walls, but we flogged it because it is the right thing to do. And we bought a different building, put a lot of money in the bank, bought a bigger building than we need to generate rental income. And there's no sentimentality about this. We're accountants rather than interior designers. So Andy laughed there. I'm widening my. So let's think about how we value early intervention and how we assess that and how we appraise. Let's think about our ability to really challenge our balance sheets. Let's also think about finance officers as business partners. You know, the most old-fashioned finance functions sort of close the accounts and then ask the auditors to come along and report on them. 20, 30 years' time, that will all be done on the push of a button, won't it? And actually, one of you will push the button to close the accounts and somebody else will push a button to audit them. You know, we live in a world of big data, and all the manual transactions that we have to deal with, big analytical tools will do that either side of the fence. Actually, our job is to add value to the organisations that we're privileged to serve, to be close to the service user, of course, the service manager, of course, to act in terms of stewardship in making sure that there's proper control. But really, as some of your previous speakers have said today, to have an appetite for risk if that's what the organisation wants, and to have better ways of assessing risk rather than saying, no, we can't do that, it's too risky. Many of the problems that our organisations are facing, the biggest risk is to do nothing, and the status quo is not an option. So if we're the people that say, no, don't form a mutual, it's too risky, no, don't use the voluntary sector more, it's too risky, no, don't enter into shared services or partnership with somebody else, it's too risky, we're letting our organisations down, because we need to be the people that can make things happen and manage the risk rather than just use risk as a veto to further action. I think also we will want to improve our skills at clienting and understanding the contractors that we're using. I think at one end of the spectrum, and it's not like this everywhere, procurement is basically we let a contract and then we see what happens. And actually the active management of a contract is more important than the way that you let it. I was a buyer for WH Smith's when I was a young man. I did their graduate scheme, and you know, it didn't matter what was in the contract. I'd ruined Parker Penn's day on many occasions because I could, because I had real leverage on them. If that's recorded, don't. Dear Rob. Anyway, and I think we need to have commercial skills to understand not about how much of our budget is being spent on a company, but how much of their turnover is dependent upon us. How much leverage have we got? That's actually more important to the relationship of clienting than simply understand what they mean in our financial management accounts. And of course, I think there are unique things about the public sector. I think we have to have an understanding of governance and the appropriateness of decision making and the legality of decision making, which is why in the syllabus recently we have strengthened public administration law. I do think that we let bigger contracts than the private sector, and we have to have those commercial skills. But actually we do need to probably understand a bit more about private sector accounting as well. and on CIPFA's part, therefore, having what I think is a perfect solution of chartered public finance accountants can also be chartered accountants, in order that we can more easily have skills between the two sectors, doesn't mean that we're taking the public sector less seriously. It just means that we recognise we need a broader range of skills in order to serve the public sector better, and change in that regard is a good thing. I also think that we will need greater skills of data analytics and really understanding the use of data. Data analytics, okay for another couple of minutes? Data analytics are phenomenal. So I'm not saying anything that's a secret here. If you think about the government saying in the last year 7 major terrorist incidents have been stopped, that is because they have got fantastic data analytical capability. They can put Andy Burns into, let's type in Andy Burns. This isn't Andy, by the way, he's not a terrorist. Yeah, I don't know, maybe he's being radicalised as I know. You'll put in Andy Burns and you think, okay, whoopee, it shows all the systems that he's on, that's just data matching. But actually, of course, the phenomenal data analytical capabilities that those services have go off to all of those systems and start to look at second, third and fourth hand information to see if there are any patterns with other second, third and fourth grade information which you would never see by the naked eye. And they will say, well, hang on a minute, this is a bit funny. When Andy Burns travelled to Istanbul 3 times in 1 year, it was the same person sitting 2 rows behind him. And that person once lived in Cardiff next to a property where we think that people had travelled to Syria and were under suspicion. And boom, all of a sudden there's a pattern put together about Andy which would never be seen by the naked eye, but the security services have a way in to seeing patterns through data analytical capability. Well, that's the way that you'll uncover fraud too. Data analytical tools in order to look at patterns. When I was at the border agency, again, I'm not saying any secrets here, I wouldn't say them. Actually, it was data analytic tools which would look at known patterns of things getting through the border, like drugs, and comparing that to our HR records where people would ask to change their shift at late notice. Bingo. And suddenly you could see regular patterns of that occurring and see the people that were taking a backhander, as we say in the East End, on the border. So these data analytical tools we will use, but actually as accountants we've got to understand them, because the interrogation capability that they give us will be part of our job too. I find all of that really exciting. It is true that 30% of jobs in an economy at any one time won't exist in 30 years' time. And I probably, I've always told the story, and I'm sorry if you've heard me say it before. When I was a kiddie, one of my favourite aunties, I dearly remember, she was the best bank teller the world had ever known, and she was just bloody wonderful at counting cash over the counter, and she used to win company awards for it. And I remember her looking me in the eye and saying, these cash machines, these hole-in-the-wall machines will never catch on. And of course, if you've spent your whole career being the best cashier the world has ever known, you would think that. But it's a job that's now redundant, just like most jobs become redundant. The role of accountancy, probably as it stands, becomes redundant unless we add real value through our skills, through the breadth of what we understand, by business partnering, through understanding things like data analytics, just as much as we have the soft skills to work with politicians, the soft skills to understand what's right and what's proper, and the ability to ensure that public money is well stewarded. For Wales, finally, I think there's an interesting time for Wales. When I talk to colleagues here, I think the most common thing I hear is, so what's the model of improvement? How will things improve? Public services want to transform, but what's the model? And I think that's an interesting question. Whether you like or loathe what happens in England, there are some clear models of improvement, whether or not you agree with them or disagree with them. Schools will get better, according to government policy, by taking them out of local authority control and letting them be independent in order to set higher standards on quality. And that is the agenda through academisation. Whether that's right or wrong, it is pretty clear to everybody what the government believes. For local government, there is a clear agenda of an end to regulation. The Audit Commission was abolished, and it's got cut by 40%. And in fairness to Eric Pickles, and it's not often I say that, my throat's gone. In fairness to Eric Pickles, he did get rid of ring fencing, he did get rid of sort of red tape, and he said you're going to have to lose 40% of your budget so you can do it your own way and be different. It's not clear at the moment how the NHS in England will work with the merger of Monitor and the TDA. One is an economic regulator around the tariff, the other is an improvement body, rather like the IDA, the Improvement and Development Agency that I used to run for English local government. What's the model of improvement? And I think you should demand from the administration clarity on what's the role of, what's the improvement model. Is there a regulatory model? Is there a self-improvement model and using benchmarking and peer review? Is there a competition model? Whether these things are right and wrong, I'm not entirely clear what the model is, other than a belief that things have to improve and things have to transform. And I think any work that can be done from the profession to ask nicely, so you want this to improve, how are we supposed to do it? What's the model? And if there are contradictions in that, to say so, then I think that's the right thing to do. And I think you have friends and partners in doing that. I think that, you know, for public bodies themselves, there are firms, there is the Welsh Audit Office, there is the Commentariat. I think the role of the profession in asking some questions, not to be pedantic, but to say if we really want this thing to work, we would like to understand policy a bit better because at the moment it isn't clear, then I think that's a good role for the profession to take. And therefore, my final competence beyond commercial skills or public administration skills is this skill of influencing people, having the soft skills. And a lot of that is about working in partnership too. You know, delivering community planning was very important in Scotland, where I was recently. Partnership working across different agencies, in my experience, is usually an important part of the journey, or indeed working with other councils or other NHS bodies or other FEs, or collaboration and partnership is a really important thing. And the only tip I'll give you, for what it's worth from my career, you know, I'm on my 4th chief executive role, one day I'll get one right. My one bit of advice is, as a leader, I think we all cast a very big shadow. If there's something we don't like about the organisation we're in, and we say, why does it operate that way? Why isn't it different? Why does it constantly do that? Why doesn't it do this? There's one place to go, and that's to the mirror and sort of take a good look, because we are the organisations that we lead. Leaders cast a very big shadow. When we're senior people in organisations, we are the organisation, and what's good about the organisation are probably our traits, and what's bad about it are probably our traits too. And the organisation is a product of us just as much as we're a product of the organisation. As a chief executive, I would never, absolutely never criticise another public body. When I was a chief executive of a council, nobody would ever hear me criticise the NHS or the FE sector or the police, because if that's the way I spoke, I was training my organisation not to trust our partners. I didn't criticise the surrounding councils, because I would be teaching my organisation that that's what I expect of you. Actually, I considered myself to be an advocate for the police and the NHS and the FE college and the voluntary sector. I viewed myself as an advocate for them in my own organisation. If I was going to be native on anyone, I would be native on the community and not the organisation that I inherited. We cast big shadows as leaders, and our behaviour is just as important as the technical skills that we have. And if we're going to transform organisations, we think about how we act and not only what we know. Thank you very much.